It was a quiet Saturday afternoon in Washington, D.C. The streets were unusually empty, the only sounds coming from the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustling of leaves in the mild autumn breeze. Justice Elijah Moore, dressed casually in a navy blue jacket and jeans, was walking down a residential street near his home. He had decided to take a break from his usual routine, enjoy some fresh air, and clear his head after a particularly intense week at the Supreme Court. It had been a week filled with high-stakes cases, lengthy deliberations, and intense discussions with his colleagues. As he walked, he noticed a police car driving slowly behind him. Elijah didn't think much of it at first. But then, the car pulled over to the curb and an officer, a young man with dark hair and a serious expression, stepped out and approached him. "Excuse me, sir," the officer said, his tone formal. "Can I have a word with you?" Elijah paused and looked at the officer, sensing an underlying tension in the exchange. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was simply out for a walk. "Is there a problem, officer?" Elijah asked, trying to remain calm. The officer glanced at him, sizing him up. There was something about Elijah that seemed to strike the officer as out of place. The way he carried himself, the calm demeanor, the ease with which he stood, it didn't quite match the typical person the officer would encounter on a quiet afternoon. His mind raced through the possibilities. Was this man a suspect? Should he be more cautious? "I'm just conducting a routine stop, sir." "You fit the description of someone we've been looking for," the officer explained, though there was a slight hesitation in his voice. "Fit the description?" Elijah repeated, his brow furrowing. "What description?" The officer didn't immediately respond. He seemed to struggle with finding the right words, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm afraid I don't have all the details, but we've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. Just want to make sure everything's okay." Elijah took a deep breath. He understood the realities of living as a black man in America. There were moments when he had to navigate being unfairly questioned or profiled. But even with his experiences, he couldn't help but feel an ache in his chest. The officer's assumptions, however unintentional, were part of a larger systemic issue that had plagued many communities for decades. "Officer," Elijah began, his voice calm but firm, "I understand you're just doing your job, but I have to tell you, this feels like an unnecessary stop." The officer shifted his weight uncomfortably, realizing that Elijah wasn't a typical citizen he could easily dismiss. Something about the man's posture, the way he spoke, made him second-guess himself. He ran his eyes over Elijah once more, as though trying to place him. "Can I see some ID?" the officer asked, his professionalism returning. Elijah sighed and reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. He handed the officer his driver's license, which displayed his full name, Justice Elijah Moore. The officer took the card, glancing at it, then back at Elijah, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Elijah Moore?" the officer muttered. He paused for a moment, then blinked, realizing something. His eyes widened in disbelief. "Wait a minute, are you Justice Moore?" Elijah nodded slowly, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, officer. I'm a justice of the United States Supreme Court." For a moment, the officer stood frozen, staring at Elijah as though he had just been struck by a bolt of lightning. His eyes flickered back to the ID in his hand and then to Elijah's calm face, as the reality of the situation set in. You're Justice Elijah Moore?" the officer repeated, his voice barely a whisper now. I didn't recognize you." "I didn't mean to." Elijah gave him a small, understanding smile. "I know, officer. It's okay. I'm just out for a walk." "You were doing your job. I'm sure you didn't expect to be stopping a Supreme Court justice." The officer took a step back, visibly flustered. "I am so sorry, sir. I didn't realize. I've seen you on TV, but I didn't recognize you out here like this. I can't believe I'm so embarrassed." Elijah raised a hand, signaling for the officer to relax. "There's no harm done. I understand. It's not every day that you find yourself stopping someone like me." The officer seemed to gather himself, his face reddening. I just didn't expect, a Supreme Court justice to be out here, walking around like this. I mean, I don't know what I thought, but... Wow. I get it, Elijah said, smiling softly. Most people probably don't expect someone in my position to be walking around without an entourage or a security detail. But sometimes, I just need a break from all the formalities. The officer hesitated for a moment before asking, so, is there anything I can do for you, sir? I mean, I'm sorry I stopped you. I can't believe this happened. Elijah chuckled lightly. No, it's fine. You've done your job. And I'm sure you've got better things to do than stand here talking to me. But since we're having this conversation, let me say something, we all make assumptions. We all have biases, some of which we don't even realize. But what matters is how we choose to act on them. I hope you'll take this as a reminder to be aware of how those biases can affect the way we treat people. The officer nodded, his expression thoughtful. You're right, sir. I'll keep that in mind. Thank you for your patience and understanding. Elijah smiled, his demeanor warm. No problem. We're all human. The officer shook his head in disbelief as Elijah turned to continue his walk. He had never expected a simple stop to turn into a life-changing encounter. It had shaken him, made him think more deeply about his assumptions, and left him with a new respect for the man he had just stopped. As Elijah walked away, he couldn't help but reflect on how moments like these were far too common for people of color in America. For many, the story wouldn't have ended with a lesson learned. But for Elijah, it was a reminder that change, even in the smallest of interactions, was possible. And sometimes, the most unexpected encounters could spark a shift in understanding, one person at a time. Later that evening, the officer shared the story with his colleagues, telling them about the surprising encounter with Justice Moore. It wasn't just a story about a mistaken identity, it became a conversation about bias, respect, and the importance of seeing people for who they truly are, beyond the surface. And for the officer, it became a lesson that would stay with him long after Elijah had walked away.